Right, hello, can you hear me, everyone? Okay, hello, my name is Ludvig Elblaus, and I will be talking today about site-specific music and modeling as an artistic practice. I'm very happy to be giving this keynote, and I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me. There will be a moderated questions section at the end, but I will try to keep track of the Q&A part of the presentation during the presentation as well, and I will take some breaks and try to catch up with any questions that have been posed on the way. So feel free to write in the Q&A section whenever you feel like it. I will be playing some musical examples during this talk, and these are also available on utrumco.com, our website, in longer formats together with other material that might be of interest. So if you like, you can also stream them from there. And the slides will also be shared on the conference website after this presentation if there's anything you wish to go back to. So I was invited today to talk about a couple of my pieces that I've been doing in the last years as part of my postdoc at KTH, and to sketch how modeling can play different parts in compositional processes and allow for compositional strategies that can lean towards the site-specific, even in cases where access to the actual site can be hard. And this presentation will be divided into 4 parts, like I said, with a Q&A section at the end as a 5th part today. And I hope that there will be more of a discussion in the end, that we could go through some of the topics that I've brought up today. So first, I will give an overview of my work in general to give you an idea about who I am and what I do. And I will also briefly discuss some of the concepts that are central to my practice that I will be using throughout the presentation today. And after that, I will take you through 2 processes, 2 commissioned pieces that I will use as 2 contrasting examples, one could say, of the modeling practice that is the topic. And finally, while the presentation of the pieces is the focus of this talk, I want to already state that the overall impression that I will try to impart is that the process of composing contemporary music can be filled with interesting technical and musical challenges suitable for SMC engineering, basically. I think composing and rehearsing are viable candidates for SMC research, and there's much important work to be done here with modeling, questions of access to infrastructure, remote presence, traveling, and the impact that all of these things also have on the compositional strategies. Some of you, I'm sure, have already considered this, and some of you might already be working on similar topics. And if you are, please get in touch or add to the discussion after the presentation. But if you haven't already considered these things, I hope to have convinced you by the end of the talk of their interesting possibilities. So, I am a composer and a musician, educated in sound and music computing here at KTH, where I took my master's degree as well as my doctorate. But I've always felt that my experience with musical composition and performance that predates my studies at KTH, by the way, has been very useful to me and has shaped my research direction throughout my work. And it has definitely shaped my stance on applying SMC and NIME research. I firmly believe that musical instruments and music technology should be explored and evaluated as a part of contemporary musical practice. And I think that we find out what a musical instrument really is in use, not exclusively in a lab, but embedded in multi-layered cultures of musicking. And that is, of course, not to say that successful lab work isn't a necessary first step, especially for very experimental or novel technologies. But again, I really think that music technology should be judged on the basis of how well it musics. And I also think that there must be a two-way flow of ideas and impulses between practice and research, or development and practice. whether we consider ourselves luthiers or engineers, the materials that we use and the things we build will be co-created, co-opted, and reimagined by the music practices we engage with. So that is why I like to see investigations into repeat performances, where performers have the time to become experts. Composers get to engage in proper compositional work related to new instruments, thereby building repertoire, and really long-term engagement on all levels, including touring and the inevitable repairs that come with that, but also other social activities around music, like education and rehearsals and rehearsability of instruments. So because of this interest, I spent most of my doctoral work actually building instruments for others, trying to widen my perspective on different performance practices, including things like circus and opera, two forms of expression that lie quite far from my own practice. But just to try to get insight into how they would affect all of the aspects of sound and music computing that I just mentioned. My latest work and the work that I will be discussing today is more about my own artistic practice. So I thought I should introduce that briefly first, and then also define some terms that will come up during this talk. Most of the work and the two pieces used as a case to draw from today has been made together with my colleague Gerhard Eckel. Many of you already know who he is, but for those who do not, he's a professor at the Institute of Electronic Music and Acoustics in Graz, and he's also affiliated professor at KTH. We have been working together since 2018, and our collaboration has continued during my postdoc and indeed formed a large part of the activities that I've been doing for the last 2 years. We have published 2 papers so far, and we're currently writing a longer paper that concerns many of the same topics that will feature here today. And together we've been working on making pieces that involve site specificity, that employ room scale acoustic feedback and modeling as an artistic practice. And these 3 concepts deserve some attention, so I think we should look at them briefly before we move on to the main matter. So much contemporary music employ feedback or loudspeakers and microphones in different forms. There's a rich history of it as well, going back quite far. A good overview for the curious would be Kathy Van Eck's book, Between Air and Electricity. And in my work, or the work that I'll be discussing today at least, I use the term room scale to denote that I make use of the space that I and the audience are both in as a venue for listening, but also as a resonating chamber in the instrument on which the music is played. And this has a couple of very important consequences, namely that the idea of the passive listener is immediately discarded, as the very fact of entering the space becomes a musical gesture in a sense, because the body of the listener in movement or at rest has the potential to change the music as it unfolds. And furthermore, there's no real listening sweet spot, or sometimes even a shared perspective on the music, in the sense that one can never be sure that what someone else is experiencing is what oneself is experiencing. And this is also further complicated by the fact that moving to another position might change the music for everyone in the room, making it hard to distinguish between variation in different parts of the room and change instigated by movement itself. So this all sounds very complicated, but the way I see it is that I embrace these ambiguities and accept that there will be a multitude of perspectives, and that every member of the audience is a co-creator in one sense, and that we all explore the experience together. Me and Gerhard as performers attend the same piece as the audience with a curiosity that the audience hopefully shares with us, but with the important distinction that we often have an extended agency compared to them, having access to certain areas or controls over the music that they do not. Following from the previous concept of room scale acoustic feedback, it is clear that the room itself then is an important actor in this music. And this is true technically, but most of all artistically. And what I mean by that is that in our work, we strive to entangle with the specific qualities of the acoustic space that we investigate. The acoustic space here means then all aspects that contribute to the electroacoustic situation, such as speakers and microphones, not just the room acoustics. And it is, of course, technically possible to create music that is practically oblivious to the space it is performed in, even using feedback techniques. But we choose not to. That is not the style of engagement that we are interested in. So in our work with the Trumco in general, and in the two specific pieces we will look at today, we strive to reduce and simplify our compositional work and our compositional additions to the spaces to arrive at performance systems that rely heavily on the particular characteristics of the site for which, or perhaps with which, they are constructed. And that is why I talk about site-specific music. And there's, of course, an interesting history of site specificity in the arts in general, originating as a countermove to the increased commercialization of modern art in the gallery system. And I think it's interesting to also discuss these political and ethical aspects of site specificity. I mean, today one might have many other reasons for localizing or situating artistic effort. There are many topics connected to this, like access, democratization, representation, and presence that we might get to in our discussion. If this is something that interests you, I would highly recommend the Mi-Won Kwon book, One Place After Another, that looks at these topics historically, but also in a very interesting contemporary fashion. And finally, then, modeling is a term that I will use today. And by that, I mean the act of investigating qualities of one system, but by looking at another system that has some, but perhaps not all, of the characteristics of the first system. So a model is often less than the thing it models. It's a reduction or a replacement that, for whatever reason, is more accessible, or for the moment at least more useful than the targeted system. This is a very big topic in itself, of course, but I hope that you'll allow me this sort of informal definition for now, and perhaps is something that we could also discuss in the Q&A session afterwards. Another very, or perhaps more succinct way of describing the situation comes from statistician George Box, who said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Coming from a more artistic perspective, I might take some issue with the sort of positive first half of that, but I still find the statement evocative. So in summary then, this talk is about my work together with Gerd Eckel. It's about composing site-specific room scale feedback pieces using modeling. We will look at two pieces today. First, a piece called Rundgång that premiered at the Elevate Festival in 2020, and then the St. Elizabeth Song Cycle that premiered at the Labor Sonore Festival in Berlin in September this year. These pieces share many musical characteristics, but I think the way modeling is employed in them is quite different. So let's see, before we move on, do we have any questions? I think not. Okay. So, Rundgång then. It's a piece commissioned for the Ina Scherem Acousmonium that premiered, like I said, at the Elevate Festival in Graz in Austria. It is a live performance with a duration of about 20 minutes, featuring 3 performers, 2 by the diffusion mixer and 1 on stage. And I think it's an example of how modeling can be used to compose for particular situations and setups, and to be able to anticipate some, but in this case, perhaps not all aspects of those situations. But the point is to extend the access to a site in time, even before the site is actually constructed. But before we get to the site, in this case, we need to talk about the Acousmonium. I said the piece is written for the Acousmonium, so what is that? The Acousmonium is a loudspeaker orchestra invented in the 70s by Francois Bayle. It's a large set of heterogeneous speakers that traditionally are used to diffuse a stereo sound source using a mixing desk-like apparatus from down in the audience seats. In an otherwise traditional concert setup, I would say. And I say mixing desk-like because instead of mixing many channels into, for instance, a stereo mix, the mixer distributes the stereo signal onto the many faders, where each fader represents one speaker in the orchestra. So pulling up one fader activates the corresponding speaker. So playing the tape piece then on the Acousmonium is quite a demanding task. It requires planning and often many rehearsals. It's a rather dramatic gestural affair where large groups of faders might need adjusting in quick succession, and this spectacle of the whole thing is very much intentional. And in addition to being a very interesting acoustic experience, the original idea of the Acousmonium was also to bring the excitement of an orchestra to tape concerts. Setting up the Acousmonium is in one way an engineering challenge, but it's also, or perhaps primarily, an artistic effort. And the nuances of the setups and the decisions may differ from time to time, taking the venue into account, but also adjusting the setup depending on the material that is to be played on the loudspeaker orchestra. And in the video here, you can see a time lapse of the Acousmonium being set up for the Elevate Festival in the Ligeti Hall in the Mumut building, where our piece was performed. So if the orchestra is a unique set of characteristic loudspeakers that are set up differently each time, how can one write music for that particular site starting months before it's even decided what speakers will be set up and how? And this is sort of the rub of it, and something that we will get into. One of our strategies was to attempt our room scale acoustic feedback techniques, but in a very reduced and focused way. So our piece, Rundgång, therefore has a very simple form and structure. Our further reduction to try to highlight the specificity of the situation was to have a single microphone on stage, and then with quite minimal processing, pan that mono source over a subset of the Acousmonium speakers, with different layers having different processing and different sets of output speaker groups, but sharing the same input, this single mic on stage. So the playback of the microphone signal over the Acousmonium speakers created a feedback loop, and that is how all of the sound was generated in the piece. And the simplicity that we aimed for is further highlighted by the start and end of the piece, where the feedback path is opened by the performer on stage, connecting the microphone cable to the mic, sitting down on stage for the duration of the piece, and then walking back up to the microphone and unplugging it, thus silencing the music. So everything was basically running at all times. We just reset it, and then it was the act of plugging and unplugging the microphone that gave the overall start and end for the whole piece. So in that sense, one could say that the piece plays with or challenges the concept of the loudspeaker orchestra by very slowly panning a mono source, the microphone, to one or at most two adjacent speakers, highlighting their specific characteristics both as acoustic projectors, but also as situated in the space with a particular distance and angle to the center of the stage where the mic is positioned, essentially breaking the orchestra up into a large number of soloists. And before we get to the process of composing the piece, I would like to get to the music. So we will listen to a very short excerpt, a few minutes from the very beginning of the piece, just to give you a glimpse of how it all sounded at the premiere. In the image here, you can see Gerhard and me at the mixing desk in our table. And you can also make out the upward facing microphone on a stand on stage. The recording is binaural, so use headphones if you can. And let me know in the chat if there's any issues with the level. Following what I've said so far, what was the site for which the composition was specific in this instance? And from the point of view of the digital, that is, I mean, between the AD and the DA, where our signal processing code lives, the site is not only the room, but the room and all involved transducers therein, that is all loudspeakers and microphones and their corresponding amplifiers and cables, etc. So if we consider them important, crucial even to the resulting music, how can we compose for them? Well, the most obvious option would be to set up the concert situation and work in there in the months leading up to the performance. And in this case, that was not possible. In fact, the Acousmonium was set up only a few days before the concert. And I would dare say that for most contemporary electronic music, it is indeed the case that the full concert setup is not made available for the composers until quite late in the compositional process. So we started by creating material in a room with somewhat similar acoustics, but not the same speakers, obviously, at the Royal College of Music in Stockholm. And we tried to investigate the fundamental assumptions underlying the piece, programming the signal processing for each layer to animate this single monosource on a monospeaker, testing if the concept held basically under real circumstances. And after about a week's work, we had a set of techniques that produced enough detail that we could believe in the concept as such. And luckily, since the venue where the piece was to be performed, the Mumet in Graz, is basically the home turf of my band member, Gerhard Eckel, we already had access to many, many acoustic measurements from that venue. So using these in combination with the planned setup of the Acousmonium loudspeaker orchestra, we could piece together a convolution model that approximated the position of the speakers, but of course not their specific characteristic and tone. So we had to merge sort of the physical acoustical experience of working in the chamber orchestra hall where we started with this cut and paste combination of different acoustic measurements that we could use digitally. And using this model, we carried on working, adjusting it as the plans for how to mount the Acousmonium developed, because that was also something that was in flux during this entire process, picking different set of measurements to match the sort of latest idea of the situation. And the models that we're using here are convolution models that are linear. So they impart the spectral characteristics on the signal, but we do not take into account the level of the signal. They are linear, basically. And of course, the point of the Acousmonium is that they are not. They are very coloring and have different distortion characteristics, and that is the point of it. So some of the speakers are basically hi-fi speakers that are quite old, and they are very, very non-linear. But again, as the Acousmonium would only be set up in the space a few days before the concert, we needed to make do with what we had. But fundamental, quite defining characteristics like time of flight, delays between different speakers and the microphone could be estimated in our models and help us during the months of composition that we needed to finish the piece. But even with our careful preparations, the on-site tuning required was quite overwhelming. We needed to fine-tune our filters and gain staging extensively to activate the Acousmonium in ways that we thought were interesting and pleasing. And the modeling, though, made it possible to attend to and incorporate the site into the work without requiring the months of access that the compositional process actually took. So while technically and artistically complex, it was a viable option that could overcome some, at least, the practical limitations of this sort of contemporary electronic music practice, the festival format, where you show up and you're expected to perform in just a couple of days. But we still managed to attempt something that could be seen as specific for the site, even though the site as such didn't even exist for several months after we started composing the piece. And I see I have a question here also. So was every performance slightly different because of the varying acoustics between performances due to different audience, etc.? And was improvisation thus a big part of the piece? I would say yes. The biggest change between the premiere and the rehearsals was that the hall was filled with audience, and the main adjustment that we were doing live was basically an overall gain staging of the system, and also a variable EQing, a live EQing of the mic signal, because there were some things, certain bass frequencies and certain quite shrill mid frequencies that sometimes could sort of get away from us. And even running the piece twice using what for us looked at as sort of identical setups, we still could get quite varying results. So yes, every performance was different, not only slightly, but it could be very different actually. Do we have any other questions before I move on to the next audio example? No? So I thought we could listen to the very end of the piece. You're gonna hear some sort of clicking, almost percussive shifts. And these are the results of the third layer that is abruptly panning, one could say, over the speaker set. So the first two layers smoothly pan, but the third layer uses a step function to immediately jump between different speakers. And then finally, at the very end, you will hear the end of the piece when our colleague on stage, Alexander Gottfarb, unplugs the microphone to end the piece. So the second piece that I would like to present is the St. Elizabeth Song Cycle. It was commissioned by the Labor Sonore Festival in Berlin and premiered there earlier this year. The theme of this year's festival was translating spaces. And when we were asked to contribute, knowing our sort of site-specific inclinations, the festival organizers, Matthias Heinisch and Andrea Neumann, began by discussing the site of our concert. And they basically asked whether we would like to compose for the Villa Elizabeth or the St. Elizabeth Church. And our response was both. We wanted to do a symmetric simultaneous performance in both spaces at once, basically, that also connected the two spaces in real time via a multi-channel audio link over a network connection. And we wanted to have mirror ensembles of electroacoustic instruments in both places. So in the end, we actually managed to do a simultaneous performance in both venues. with a duration of 4 hours. And at this point, I would also like to say that I'm very grateful to Matthias and Andrea that they allowed us to attempt this idea and that they also supported us throughout the whole process. So the first space was a rather large church, heavily damaged in World War II, that was later rebuilt and is now used as a concert venue. And the second space is the villa next door, a large 3-story house that houses a saal on the second and third floor that became our second performance venue. And in these two spaces, we placed 2 identical ensembles. So in each room, we had an augmented double bass fitted with a transducer and a contact microphone, allowing us to inject sound into the bridge from one side, sending energy into the whole instrument in a similar way to if it was bowed, while listening to the other side of the bridge. We also had a snare drum outfitted with a loudspeaker element suspended inside the drum. And the snare also had a contact mic attached, as you can see in the picture here. So again, allowing both signal inputs and outputs. Finally, each room also had a regular air mic, a PA top speaker, and a subwoofer. And this was the resulting placement of the ensembles in the 2 spaces. The villa to the left and the church to the right. And this is not to scale. The church is about twice as big as the villa, but you can see that the patterns are similar. So all in all, considering both rooms, our ensembles gave us a rather dense graph of possible paths for the audio signal to travel. And remember here that the 2 rooms were also connected so that any input in one room could be played back on any output in the other room. So this is a sketch of the possible connections. It doesn't include the sub, but all of the sort of full range signal paths. So with the sub, in reality, there's actually even more options. So how do we compose for this? Well, we had even more problems than this. Stepping back to the beginning of the compositional process, our first challenge was that both me and Gerd and our 2 double basses were separated. So I was in Stockholm and he was in Graz, and we were going to have to spend most of the compositional process that way because travel was made impossible because of the pandemic. So what we needed to do was to implement this double venue idea also for our compositional setup. But instead of connecting 2 rooms in adjacent buildings in Berlin, we needed to connect my studio in Stockholm with his studio in Graz. So that's what we did. We created symmetrical setups, starting with computer, sound card, the double bass, an air mic, a regular speaker, and began composing that way using jack trip to send bidirectional audio. And we wanted to be able to rehearse together over a network connection, but we also wanted to be able to test things by ourselves, which meant that we needed to be able to replicate the other person's remote setup if our counterpart was not online to work with us. And furthermore, we also needed to be able to simulate the rooms and instruments digitally to some degree, both our own local instruments and the remote instruments, if we didn't have our snares and double basses set up. So this led to the following matrix of options that needed to be implemented and switched between rather easily. And setting up these different configurations very quickly, it became obvious that we were going to need to automate this. Because as the composition progressed, we also divided all of our signal processing code into several different supercollider servers. We used Reaper as a mixing and monitoring tool. We had the networking clients that needed to be patched in. We had gain compensation systems to be able to set the level in each space without affecting the level internally for the signal processing. And we had these different routings that needed to be able to switch between or select depending on which option in the matrix from the previous slide that were targeted. So all in all, in the final version of the system, if you run everything on one machine, we started 44 jack clients, and we made, if I think I counted it correctly, 541 jack connections. So a big part of managing this rehearsal process was also creating interfaces and for automation of all of these different setups and teardowns, managing the resources, and reliably being able to reproduce these things, because doing it manually was, of course, an incredibly big source of errors and problems. And these models then, wise from the earlier piece, we went to both spaces well in advance of the performance and measured the exact setup that we were going to use. So basically we brought one set of the ensemble to Berlin and used it to measure both spaces. So we had one set of a bass, a snare, etc. And for the acoustic measurements, we of course wanted as clean a signal as possible, but we also recorded ambient sound and preamp noise that we could inject into our models, because our system was quite sensitive, so it reacted strongly to these things. So it was a very thorough process, but it was highly necessary for us to be able to work in the way that we needed to do. So that allowed us to complete our system with simulations of the physical spaces with the ensemble positioned correctly and the levels calibrated. And here's a short screen recording of, you can see the floor plan of the two places, and the instruments are placed where they should be, and pressing them injects noise into their corresponding convolution models, and the little wedge that you see is the position of the binaural microphone that was used to record the measurements. So because of the complexity created already by just placing the double ensembles in the venues, we felt that we needed to add very little complexity beyond that point. It was more, the process was more about reducing and focusing into the situation that we've already created. So the structural concept of the piece was to exploit the many possible paths in the graph of connections and construct a set of layers that we called spinners that would be mirrored in the two rooms. And we call them spinners because they spun around the graph of possible connections and simply created connections between different sets of inputs and outputs. So in the aggregate effect of the many overlapping spinners was that a wealth of different feedback paths were activated in cyclical patterns that slid in and out of phase with each other to quite dramatic effect. And furthermore, during the piece, only the output level and the spinning, that is the scanning and panning of the inputs and outputs of each spinner, would be modulated. So in the video here, you can see an interface that visualizes the output levels of the individual spinners and the resulting amplitude envelope of all of them together over the course of the duration of the piece. And because of the long duration of the piece, we needed, of course, to be able to jump to any point in the score and not deal with the full 4 hours every time we made a small change somewhere in the piece. So I thought that we would listen also a little bit to this piece. This time it's about an hour into the St. Elizabeth song cycle from the perspective of the church. The excerpt is 7 minutes, but I'm not going to play all of it, but it's available again on our website if you want to have a listen later. But I'll just play a few minutes of the start of it here. Right, so I got a question here. Did you only use noise as an excitation, and if so, why? I guess you're referring to the screen recording with the with with the where we injected noise into the models. Actually, for the piece, we didn't excite the systems beyond what with anything beyond the noise that was already present in the system. So we didn't put in any external signals except for when we manipulated the snare and the bass. But no other signals were needed to get the system going as such. But it was basically just cranking up the volume until things started to sound. Yeah, cheers. So all in all, this process was, I would say, even more successful than the previous one with Rundgång. And the piece worked very well, and the sort of foregrounding or highlighting of the entrance of the two rooms was quite effective. Also, with the audience feedback and reviews that we got, really convinced us that many of the subtleties that we had assumed would be quite hard for audiences to catch were legible in the resulting acoustic environment, like how one could hear one room filtered through another room, or an audience member's footsteps on the creaky floor of the villa, bringing the sort of wooden creaky shimmer of that space out into the church, for instance. So there were many interesting acoustic juxtapositions like that, interesting contrasts. And again, because of the dual venues, the 4-hour-long duration of the piece, we only managed to run through the piece once on site before the premiere, allowing only for quite minor tuning and adjustments. So the year-long preparations before the work of this incremental modeling, without that, it would have been completely impossible to even attempt something like this. So I hope that these two examples have suggested how modeling can allow a site-specific compositional practice even when access to the site is limited, at least limited in terms of the duration of the compositional work. And I want to again point out how the modeling that I'm talking about is a composite of the artistic imagination as well as the acoustic measurements and resulting simulations. So trusting the reduction of the model blindly is not the way to site-specific music, in my opinion, but instead you need to develop also a careful listening practice where models can be understood as partial perspectives that can lend different insights but never replace the physical on-site experience. So put in another way, if the models are truly equal or even an improvement on the site, I think then the models become a direction in themselves to explore. So, I mean, sadly, or perhaps thankfully, that has never been the case for me so far. But I really think it's important to develop a critical listening to reduce also things like the risk of overfitting to the model. What I mean by that is it's easy to become sort of enamored with certain qualities or aesthetic gestures that are perhaps possible in a digital simulation, but that might be near impossible to recreate on site. And we have sometimes employed randomized delay times or other filtering to introduce uncertainty and smear this perfect reproduction of the linear digital simulation with good results. So overall, I think the composer perspective is something that we as a community could address more often. Perhaps it is sometimes overshadowed by performer perspective or audience perspective. We deal with musical production and studio work that is often addressed, but I think asking composers what they would need from future SMC research could be interesting and worthwhile. And I think in a wider perspective that we can ask ourselves the question how we as an SMC community can approach this sort of tension between an increasingly international mobile social musicking community and the need to restrict travel, and how we can aid in composition and production and distribution of high quality artistic experiences, supporting artists in their work of democratizing access and inclusion. Because I think there's great democratic potential in this work, where we can see a wider group of musicking practitioners gain access to spaces and situations that are exclusive, expensive, or as it has become painfully obvious in the last years, inaccessible because travel is hindered for pandemic or environmental reasons. And I see I have a question here. What are the biggest technical challenges in your research, and when do you feel satisfied with the results? Do you have a success criteria? Yeah, maybe we can get back to that in the Q&A. But I would just like to say thank you for listening and reiterate that these slides will be made available on the NordicSMC conference website. There's more information on music on my website and on mine and Gerhard's website. And finally, also, I would just like to thank the Navet Center for providing my postdoc position, and again, thank Gerhard Eckel and IEM for this collaboration.
Okay, let's have a round of virtual applause wherever we are. Thanks a lot, Ludvig, for an extremely inspiring presentation. And it's incredible to see the possibilities with type-based composition. Let's have a look at the questions. So there are two questions in the Q&A, as you've been keeping track, I see. Yeah. The first one is quite broad and existential in nature. And the second one is a bit more specific. So you can choose which one you want to begin with, and then we can kick off the discussion that way. So,
well, let's start with a non-existential one, perhaps, just to warm up. A music acoustics question. Do you pre-process the signal that is exciting the bridge of the double bass? Well, yes. All of the signals that are outputted are the results of the processing of one or more of the available input signals. Now, it's not a particular processing that is made because the signal is about to be injected into the double bass. I mean, all of the spinners are composed in a way so that they make use of their inputs in a way that we find aesthetically interesting, of course. But we don't do any particular processing for the double bass. I mean, let's see if there are other questions also, but there are some things about the bridge resonances and some things that we struggle with a little bit, but that's very, very detailed information that I don't think everyone is interested in. But let's leave it at that for now and just say that all of the outputs were indeed processed. So there was no, let's say, direct contact between the inputs and the outputs. There was always some kind of supercollider thing in between. Right, and then we're back to the biggest technical challenges in our research. Well, perhaps one of the things that I see as future work that I will get into is to move beyond the convolution models to also introduce more non-linear stages in the modeling and try to emulate parts of those aspects of the systems. Because while it is one thing to say that a Genelec monitor doesn't have the coloring of an old French 70s hi-fi speaker, once you start to excite a snare drum, I mean, then you're in a whole different world immediately. So there you have a lot of different coupled system, you have hysteresis, you can go into different modes. So the system itself has a memory of where it's been. So something that I'm starting to play around with now are different modal models or waveguide models to construct small sort of systems that could emulate at least some aspects of the highly nonlinear nature of some of the things that we have been introducing into our music. Satisfaction I will maybe leave aside, but success criteria, I think that for this kind of research that is of course overlapping somehow with artistic research, I think the success criteria is what kind of aesthetic experience and aesthetic discussion one can instigate from this material. So after Berlin, for instance, we were able to have very interesting discussions and share experiences about this superposition of rooms that I don't think would have been possible without actually experiencing that piece. So in that sense, I guess that's a kind of success criteria, quite different from the from the rigorous alternatives that will be presented in the panel, I'm sure. But I think that, to come back to my first point about engaging with musical practice, then we need to also acknowledge that the values of that musical practice should guide the development on the technical side. Yes, and we have a raised hand, I think, or?
Yes, we have 2 raised hands, and
okay.
The Oslo Hub has had its hand raised for quite a while, so maybe we can begin with them.
I'll trust you, yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Ludvig, for a very nice presentation. We're listening here on a quite nice hi-fi speaker system, so it was very nice to hear the sound also in fairly high quality, which is in stereo even. So that's also something about, now getting to my question or comment is well, first the comment is that everybody is talking about latency these days and how the challenges of latency is hindering kind of musical collaboration. But I guess in your case, I mean, you're using latency also actively as part of this process is one thing. But then more perhaps more conceptually, you're talking about compositional practice and spaces. And in my research, I'm working a lot with instruments and performance, and trying to conceptualize what an instrument is. So I was just wanting to if you could think a little bit about because you're also building a huge instrument in a way with kind of the combination of a kind of a small and perhaps normal instrument, but inside of one space that could kind of be considered as part of the instrument, and then you're extending it to another space even that's also could be part of the instrument. So could you talk a little bit more about kind of the performance and instrumental aspects of this as opposed to the compositional?
Right. First of all, regarding the latency, in the end, connecting the 2 rooms in Berlin using a regular network cable, we used the SITA system for sending the audio, and the latency that we had was actually shorter than the time of flight between the 2 points. So the church, for instance, the speaker that was furthest from the microphone in the church had a longer time of flight latency than our digital transmission. So once you move into that scale of things, that felt like it was, we were actually considering adding a delay to the network connection to make it fit exactly the time of flight that would have been between the 2 spaces. But latency is a very interesting thing that we could talk a lot about, and also resampling and doing things remotely. There's a lot of nuance there, and that was of course a much bigger problem when we were doing the jack trip connections between Austria and Stockholm, because that incurred more latency than a LAN connection over a wire. But coming back to your second question then about performing, also a big topic, of course, but what I really enjoy with these instruments that we are inside of basically is that performing and experiencing overlap in a way that is quite interesting to me. So in a venue like the church, the human body is quite small and insignificant in a way. So there you need a group of people to really influence the acoustics. But in smaller spaces and in other concerts that we've done, we have also performed by just moving around. So we can move somewhere and dampen a node and push the system into another state. But that also brings with it this sort of confusion of roles, or that I talked about in the beginning, where to experience it, you will also influence it. So there is no way to be passive. And that also puts these questions of performing into kind of a different state than how we usually discuss them, because you cannot passively just sort of listen. By putting your ears into the space, you are dragging your body with your ears, and that body is going to dampen and shield and influence the whole situation for everyone. So I think that's the part of performing with these instruments that I find the most interesting, actually, that it's a shared co-created experience where no one is allowed to sort of experience it fully. I mean, you can listen to a recording of it, but if you're going to be present in the space and experience this, how it unfolds in space and how different it sounds if you just tilt your head or move around a little bit, then you're also starting to engage with it in a performative sense. And I think that that sort of diffusion is a very, very interesting aspect of it. It's a partial answer, at least.
Okay, and we have one more question from Razvan. So I think we have time to take it. Yeah.
Thanks, Ludvig. Very, very cool presentation and very nice to hear your sound demos. I have a question. Maybe it's like the black sheep type of question, but you're aiming to reproduce a space to be able to facilitate the compositional process. But have you ever considered in these two projects how to include the ephemerality of the space in the composition? So the fact that it is going to be for a limited time, that can be exploited as a creative aspect in the compositional stage. Have you thought about
that? Yes, I think the fact that the experience of being physically present is so completely different from everything, from all the other options. And the fact that we are actually generating all of the sounds live. So it is the feedback that is going on in the space that is the only thing that you're hearing. And that means that you have this sort of presence or ephemerality, as you put it, of knowing that this is something that is happening now. Even trying to record it is actually quite difficult. And both the recordings that I played for you today are, in my mind, very, very different from the experience of actually being in the space. So I would agree with you that perhaps that's some good words to end on, that the site specificity is about the ephemeral quality of the particularity of the situation and the preciousness of knowing that this is something that even if one would try to reproduce it the day after, it might not even be possible, right? So it's a very intensely shared experience that has a preciousness to it, I think. And that's 10 o'clock, I